Are you studying economics at university or elsewhere? Well, a lot of what you're going to be told is just wrong. For a start, the economics profession as a whole comes from a viewpoint that markets are perfect. What does it mean for a market to be perfect? Essentially, that the market will arrive at prices which balance exactly demand and supply. At the end of the day, a market will clear. There won't be anything left unsold, and there won't be people who really wanted to buy at the price that's being offered who couldn't buy. Demand equals supply, and the prices make sure that happens. That's the whole fundamental idea behind markets, and indeed behind economics. The prices that markets arrive at are believed to be equilibrium prices. You're sure to come across these demand and supply diagrams that look like this. The idea is to show that one specific price is the price that balances supply and demand, and that is the price that the market will find, end up at, and stay at. Any change from that price, and it will be forced back to where it started. This is the idea of equilibrium, that the market finds a perfect balance and just stays there. That might not sound very much like the operation of markets that you're used to. For example, if you buy and sell things on the stock market where prices seem to go up and down almost at random, or indeed if you're even trying to buy something on eBay, some days you'll be lucky, some days you won't. There doesn't seem to be much of an equilibrium concept to prices in these markets. Never mind. If you're on a mathematically inclined course, you'll undoubtedly be introduced to what's called the first welfare theorem of economics. And this is a large chunk of mathematics which is supposed to prove that under a whole bunch of highly unlikely assumptions, but let's leave that aside, that an equilibrium state of the economy will be reached, which is so-called Pareto optimal. What's Pareto optimal mean? It means that you can't make one person in that economy any economically happier than he is at those equilibrium prices without making somebody else economically less happy. So the prices that are set are perfect in the sense that any change will make somebody worse off. Now, this is a pretty miserable sort of objective to have, because in real world terms, if you can make 1 million people better off and only 10 worse off, you'd jump at the opportunity to do that, wouldn't you? But no, for economists that's irrelevant. As long as one person is worse off, then Pareto optimality is achieved, and apparently the market has arrived at the perfect set of prices. You might want to notice that in fact one person owning everything in the world would be Pareto optimal, because if you wanted to change that situation to give other people a bit of ownership, that one person would necessarily lose a bit and be worse off. So what the use of this Pareto optimality concept is in the real world is frankly more or less nothing. If we actually look at the real world, do we find these perfect prices and these equilibrium states of an economy? Well, if you look at any real economy with its ups and downs from year to year, it suggests not. But some economies behave differently to others, and one economy may behave differently at one time to another time, so it's a little bit messy to try and pick out actual data to prove or disprove economic theories. So what we'll do instead is simply contrast the current models of economics which you're going to be taught with an alternative model which is based on more realistic assumptions. The alternative model that we're going to use is explained in other videos on this channel if you'd like to see the details. And it's based on real-world concepts. First, the concept of confidence, that business confidence is a thing that drives a lot of economic activity. This is nothing new. It was suggested certainly as far back as Keynes in the middle of the last century. However, it's been ignored by the economics mainstream. Secondly, we're going to assume that people take economic decisions heuristically. That is to say, they take simple decisions using extremely limited information, and basically those decisions are myopic. They're not looking forwards into the future a great deal. They're just doing what seems to be sensible to do today. For example, in using heuristics, if we find that at the end of a period we've got unsold goods left over, then two things will happen. First of all, we will reduce the price of those goods a bit, and secondly, we will reduce the investment we make into producing those goods a bit. Those amounts that we reduce both investment and prices by, they will be determined very simplistically depending upon how much was unsold last period. So it may be that those reductions are not enough, or it may be that those reductions are too much. In the next period, we may find that now, not only do we not have unsold goods, but in fact we couldn't supply a lot of people who were clamouring for them. Or it may be that we still have unsold goods, just slightly less than we had last period. We don't know, we'll find that out in the next period. Another heuristic in this model is that the higher the business confidence level is, the more people are willing to spend and the more they will want to borrow in order to spend. So business confidence will be one important driver of how much the economy grows. So you can see that these heuristics are very straightforward, common sense approaches, and you can contrast that with, again, what you'll be taught in your economics course, which is that economies consist of rational actors, people who have perfect foresight of everything the economy is likely to do into the indefinite future, and they can therefore make their actions today to maximize their future welfare over their lifetimes. A fairly crazy set of assumptions, I'm sure you'll agree. So let's look at this alternative model in operation and see if, with this alternative model, markets clear and if the economy arrives at some sort of equilibrium where prices are optimal and things don't really change much. This very simple implementation of the alternative model just has two classes of people: owners of firms and workers. Owners of firms both consume resources and invest some of their income into building up the business. Workers simply consume the money they're paid and work for their wages. Now, if we watch the model evolve, we can see that every period some investment will be made into the business, and therefore the productive capacity of the economy will increase. As it increases, more goods can be produced, and therefore those goods are spread around between the workers and the owners, and everybody becomes better off. One of the issues we talked about was whether markets actually clear. We can see here, looking at two of the elements, supply and demand graph being shown as part of the model output, is at a level of 1 if supply and demand are in fact perfectly in balance and the market clears. If the supply and demand curve is above 1, that means there was more demand than could be satisfied. If the supply and demand curve is below 1, that means that we produced too much and we couldn't sell it all. And this is backed up by another graph there, which is the unsold amounts. So if we look at these two over time, you'll see that in fact, although the supply and demand curve tends to fluctuate around the value 1, it's very rarely at 1. Nearly always it's above or below a bit, which means the market is not clearing. There is either unmet demand or there is unsold product. So in this model, markets don't clear. The sensible heuristic steps that people take when they don't clear means that markets tend to stick roughly around the clearing level, but it's very rare that they're actually clearing. Now, the other question we raised was about whether the economy reaches some sort of equilibrium state, where prices are somehow perfect and everything stays more or less the same because everything is perfectly balanced. Well, the clear answer is no, it doesn't. This economy grows, and it grows in phases, and we can see every so often there's a bit of a recession and it shrinks a bit and then it starts to grow again. And this is, of course, exactly typical behaviour of real economies that we see in real life. But this is not equilibrium behaviour. There is no equilibrium in this alternative model. So according to our common sense model of the economy, equilibriums just don't happen. The economy is a dynamic, evolving system, and it doesn't say in a stationary state for any length of time. But another thing you'll be told is that since the standard economic belief is that equilibriums do occur, that if a shock happens to the economy, let's say an oil price rise, that will have an immediate effect, but that effect will soon die out because the economy is naturally attracted back to its equilibrium state. So there'll be a sudden short change in behaviour, and then everything will go back to what it was before. Well, is this true? Let's take our alternative model, our common sense model of the economy, give it a shock. The shock we'll give it in this case is to the workers' spend. We're going to think that for a short period, from time 30 to time 33, those workers are going to spend 20% less. I don't know why. Perhaps they're just worried about the general state of the world, but they've decided to keep some more money for themselves. They'll either borrow less or they'll actually save money in their bank accounts and spend 20% less. That's quite a big shock to this closed economy. Now, we'll see how the economy develops over the first few time periods before we get to the shock. And we can see this now, everything is growing nicely as it did indeed before. Nothing's happened any differently to the last runs that we showed, but at the time we get to the point time equals 30, we will see, first of all, at the top, that there is a deep shock to the spend of the workers in the economy. And then we will see that the effect that this actually has. Now we'll pause the simulation at this point just to see the immediate effect as the shock starts to hit. The immediate effects are, first of all, that there's a downturn in most things. The price starts to drop. The number of units that are bought in the economy, essentially the GDP, starts to drop. The debt-to-income ratios change. For the workers, the debt-to-income ratio goes down. They've now got less debt compared to their income because, of course, they're spending less. Whereas for the owners, the firms, their debt-to-income ratio immediately peaks. It goes up because for them, they're getting less income since the workers are spending less and their debts are still there, so the ratio will increase. Now, almost immediately after that, those ratios then start to alter again because the effects of this shock are not simple. They then feed through into the rest of the system. So, for example, the firms, seeing that they're getting less spend from the workers, will themselves start to react in order to reduce the amount of goods and perhaps to change the price so that in fact their debt-to-income ratio can to some extent recover. So as we now go on to see what happens after the initial phase of the shock, we can follow the system through as it evolves over time. And what we see slowly as the system evolves is that this shock has long-term effects compared to the unshocked economy, which is shown in the top left-hand corner. We can see that the shocked economy over time has fewer oscillations in its output, looking at the units sold output at the bottom right of the pictures, and it has a higher level of spirits and a higher overall level of units sold, that is, of GDP. So the effects of the shock are persistent. We don't see that the system goes back to where it was before, but a shock at time 30 is still having effects at time 60. Now, this is in fact completely opposed to the standard economic view of shocks and their effects, but it is very consistent with the science of complex systems. Studies that have been made in various areas, physics, biology, economics, of complex systems, feedback loops and things of this sort, show that we have a strong tendency to so-called path dependency. If you change something at one point, it will have long-term effects on the system. And this is related to the popular concept of the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in South America, and a week later there's a change in the weather in Germany. And another effect that we might expect from complex systems, and that we do see here, is that of emergent behavior. What we've done in this shock is essentially to try to damage the economy. We've stopped people spending so much for a period. So we would logically expect that the economy will suffer because of that, that it will go into a worse position than it was before, possibly bounce back if we believe in this equilibrium effect. But it doesn't. What actually happens is that over the longer term, despite the initial decrease in GDP, which we saw when the units produced just at the beginning of the shock, over the longer term, looking at periods around 60, we can see that the final level of units sold of GDP is actually higher than in the unshocked system. So what would have appeared to have been a negative shock has actually produced a positive effect on the economy. This is a sort of emergent effect, something unexpected which happens in complex systems. Nothing of the sort is expected in standard economic theory. Now, another thing that you may well be taught in an economics course is that bubbles, price bubbles, don't really exist. Because in standard economics belief, prices and markets are perfect, if prices go up at some point or plunge down at another, this must be a rational reaction to some fundamental change in the market. But of course, in real life, we do see prices sometimes going up, sometimes going down, and very often this doesn't appear to be due to anything very logical, fundamental, or rational. Bubbles seem to have a life of their own, things become popular, people rush to try and buy them, and perhaps after a while the fashion dies out and the price drops off again. It's very easy to see this sort of thing happening in the stock market for certain shares. Let's look at what actually happens in our model. Here's the graph which shows the development of prices over time in the previous model run, and here we fit to this curve an underlying smooth curve which shows the general trend of the prices. If we compare the actual prices at any given time with that underlying curve, we can see that at some points the prices are higher, they've bubbled up, and at some points they've fallen below that curve. So in this model, bubbles do exist. It's the same underlying good. It hasn't gained or lost in value, but the price has gone up and down. Bubbles exist in this model. A further thing that you're almost bound to come across is something called the Phillips curve. This is a relationship which economists believe they've found between employment or unemployment and the level of inflation. It's considered that if you want low unemployment, then you're going to have to put up with relatively high inflation, and vice versa. If you want low inflation, you're going to have to put up with relatively high levels of unemployment. Well, again, although this seems to be a sort of accepted truth in much of economics, does it actually happen in our common sense economic model? Well, let's run the picture and have a look at those two specific things, the unemployment level and the inflation level. So this is exactly the same run we've shown before of the model, and as you can see the two developing over time, you could look to see whether in fact they're related. And the simple answer is there is very little relationship between the levels of employment and the levels of inflation in this model. A Phillips curve does not really exist for this model. It's another piece of interesting economic fiction. The final economic myth that we'll deal with in this video is to do with inflation. It's often considered, especially by the monetarist school of economics, but in fact in general, that government spending, relaxation of the money supply, or quantitative easing in modern days, is the root cause of inflation. Well, is this really the case? If we introduce quantitative easing into our model, that is, we shall give to the firms for a certain period an increase in the amount of money they have available to spend, and in our model this will be from the period time equals 30 to time equals 33. You can consider this as a 3-year period of quantitative easing, during which we will increase the amount of money available for firms to spend by 20%. So that's a pretty sizable allowance, a pretty sizable amount that could affect future inflation. What do we actually see when we run the model? The top left of the screen in green, we will see what happens when there is no quantitative easing, and in the bottom right, in the brown section of the screen, we will see what happens when there is this 3-period quantitative easing allowed from time 30 to time 33. The two top windows in each of these sections show you the income of, respectively, the owners and the workers, and the bottom two windows will show us inflation, which is the thing we're mainly interested in, and the total GDP, that is the total units bought in the economy. Well, what we will see is that in fact at time 30 the spend does go up and the number of units bought goes up accordingly. But what happens to inflation? Inflation, in fact, stays more or less constant at about 9% over the succeeding several periods. Now, as it happens, just after time 30, we're going to come to a natural recession point in this model in any case, as we've seen before. So that still occurs, and the effect of the additional quantitative easing is simply to sort of ease the path of the economy. It doesn't descend into as much of a dip as it did previously, and then goes back into a growth phase. And we can see that in fact, again, over the longer term, this 3-period intervention of quantitative easing does have an effect. By period 60, we can see that the economy is in a better state. It's producing around 37 units compared to the 30 units it produces without that quantitative easing stimulus. And inflation over the long term is a little higher, but only by around 2 percentage points. At a peak, it goes from about 18% to 20%. So there is an effect on inflation, but it's a relatively low level effect. Most of the cause of inflation is the natural dynamics of the economy, and we get it without any quantitative easing. If we add in the quantitative easing, there's a slight addition, but the main effect of the QE is in fact on the overall path and the overall growth of the economy, which is improved. So is it the case that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon? No, it's not. Inflation is largely a function of the dynamics of the evolving economy, and the money supply is but a small component of inflation. That concludes this video, but it should give you an idea of the sort of truths which are promulgated within economics courses, which are hardly truths at all. In fact, in many cases, they're the complete opposite.